Paris, September 3, 1792. The air was thick with smoke and sweat as a mob surged through the gates of La Force prison. Somewhere inside, behind stone walls and rotting iron bars, a woman waited, not as a criminal, but as a symbol. She was royalty, but not a queen. She was gentle, but not weak. She had no army, no crown, no scepter, only her loyalty, and it would cost her everything. Marie-Thérèse. Louise of Savoy, Princess de Lamballe, once glided through the mirrored halls of Versailles, with grace and silence, a shadow at the side of Marie Antoinette. She was the confidant of a queen, elevated not by ambition, but by affection, appointed to guard the dignity of the crown in a court already cracking beneath the weight of its own decadence. In another life, she might have disappeared into history as a quiet noblewoman remembered only in letters and portraits. But history had other plans. Now, in the heart of revolutionary Paris, her name burned with a different fire. To the enraged citizens outside, she wasn't a woman, she was a symbol of everything they had risen against. Foreign-born, soft-spoken, loyal to a hated monarchy, her virtues became her sentence. That morning, without a trial, without even a pretense of justice, she was dragged before a makeshift tribunal. The question was short. The answer was fatal. She would not betray the queen. What followed wasn't execution, it was spectacle. Her death was not enough. They paraded her head through the streets, lips rouged, hair carefully arranged by the same hands that had torn it from her scalp. It was a message, a warning, a grotesque celebration of revolution unchained. And as her severed head reached the walls of the Temple prison, where Marie Antoinette awaited her own fate, the world seemed to pause. This was not just the fall of a noblewoman. This was the day the revolution lost its mask. She was born into privilege, but privilege alone never guaranteed safety, not in France, not in the late 18th century, and certainly not for a woman like Marie-Thérèse Louise of Savoy. From the moment she entered the world on September 8, 1749, in Turin, Italy, her life was touched by elegance. The House of Savoy was one of the oldest and most powerful royal families in Europe, its name stitched into centuries of dynastic marriage and territorial ambition. She was raised in palaces, educated to serve with poise and discretion, and trained to understand the etiquette of courts, where silence often spoke louder than declarations. At 17, she was married off to Louis-Alexandre de Bourbon, Prince of Lamballe, a grandson of Louis XIV. The match was strategic and splendid, at least on the surface. Within a year, he was dead. The cause a mix of libertine excess and disease. His death left her widowed and childless before her 18th birthday, a symbol of tragedy cloaked in satin. Most women in her position would have returned quietly to their family estates or remarried to secure their status. She did neither. Instead, she drew closer to the epicenter of royal power. At Versailles, she caught the eye of Marie Antoinette, a young Austrian-born dauphine, still struggling to win the affection of a court that viewed her with suspicion. Their bond formed quickly. They were both foreign-born, both isolated in a world of ruthless scrutiny, and both burdened in different ways by the expectations of being women in a monarchy ruled by men who played politics like chess. But if Antoinette was the glamorous queen-in-waiting, sparkling and untouchable Lamballe was the sanctuary. Soft-spoken, devout, emotionally reserved, she offered something rare. In court, a quiet, incorruptible friendship. In 1774, when Louis XVI ascended the throne and Marie Antoinette became queen, Lamballe's place was secured. She was appointed superintendent of the Queen's household, the highest title a woman could hold in the royal domestic hierarchy. The title gave her control over the Queen's private life, her correspondence, her finances, even the moral tone of the women allowed in her inner circle. But it also painted a target on her back. While courtiers smiled, their envy festered. Pamphleteers mocked her in vile caricatures, accusing her of everything from manipulation to decadence. Even her virtue was turned against her. To the libertine elite, her celibacy was not chastity, it was weakness. To the revolutionaries gathering outside the gates, her closeness to Antoinette made her complicit in every injustice imagined by a starving, angry populace. But she never flinched. Through whispers and ridicule, through the court's shift from brilliance to paranoia, she remained unwavering. Her loyalty was not performative, it was bone deep. Even as other nobles retreated from Versailles, distanced themselves from the monarchy, and sought exile as the storm gathered, Lamballe stayed. Not out of ignorance, not out of arrogance, but because in her world, duty was not optional. By 1789, as revolution boiled into open revolt, Versailles was no longer safe. The royal family was forced to flee to Paris prisoners in their own capital. Many of their closest allies scattered like leaves in a storm. But Lamballe followed. She abandoned her wealth, her freedom, and every ounce of safety to remain at Marie Antoinette's side. To the Queen, she was no longer just a confidant. She was one of the last people she could trust. And in the streets of Paris, where bread lines curled around corners and heads of aristocrats began appearing on pikes, that loyalty was seen as treason. The name Lamballe was no longer whispered in salons. It was shouted in taverns, painted in blood across walls. Her image was smeared in newspapers that called for her head as loudly as they mocked the Queen's hemlines. She had become, whether she wanted it or not, a living embodiment of the ancien regime. And the people wanted vengeance. It would have been easy to leave. She had offered safe passage, foreign protection, promises of asylum in England or Austria. All she had to do was walk away. But she didn't. When asked why she gave no speeches, she wrote no memoirs. She simply stayed. In doing so, she sealed her fate. She didn't carry a sword. She didn't write laws. She didn't oppress anyone. Yet in the eyes of revolutionaries drunk on blood and slogans, she was guilty. Guilty of grace, guilty of silence, guilty of being loyal to a doomed queen. In the final months before her arrest, she was rarely seen in public. Her name faded from the court's diminishing records, and the once vibrant socialite became a ghost, wandering the ruins of a world that no longer existed. But inside the palace walls, she was still there, comforting the Queen's children, praying quietly in corners, and waiting for something she would never be able to stop. The revolution was coming for her, and she knew it. In the waning summer of 1792, the smell of fear hung heavier than gunpowder over Paris. The monarchy had crumbled into something spectral, still present, but barely breathing. On August 10th, a storm unlike any seen before erupted at the Tuileries Palace. The king's guards, known as the Swiss, were massacred where they stood. The royal family barely escaped with their lives. What had once been royal grounds became a battlefield, soaked in blood and dust, overrun by armed citizens, screaming not for reform, but for annihilation. Amid the chaos, Princess de Lamballe was captured. She had not taken up arms. She had no orders to give. She was found where she had always been close to the Queen, standing silent, dignified, and entirely unarmed. That silence, once a virtue at court, was now seen as an insult to the people's fury. She was dragged from the palace and taken not to a courtroom, but to La Force, one of the city's darkest and most infamous prisons. La Force was not a place for nobility. It was a festering pit of broken bodies and broken minds crawling with lice and disease. It stank of human waste sweat, and something worse, hopelessness. Here, women of birth and women of the streets Shared cells stripped of all distinction. Titles meant nothing inside those walls. But even in rags, Lamballe's presence unsettled the guards. She prayed aloud. She refused to weep. She tended to the ill. She didn't beg. Outside the prison, the city's mood twisted into something feral. The September massacres had begun. Whispers had morphed into chants. Fear had become frenzy. Revolutionaries had broken into other prisons, slaying priests, nobles, and servants alike in a torrent of rage. The streets ran red for days. Heads were hoisted on pikes. Children watched from windows as the old order was butchered in the name of liberty. The terror was not surgical. It was chaos with a heartbeat. Inside La Force, the prisoners could hear the screaming. Each night someone else vanished from their cells and never returned. By the time guards opened Lamballe's door on September 3rd, the floor was already slick with the blood of those who had refused to confess, or simply hadn't confessed fast enough. She was summoned not to answer for any crime, but to survive a ritual. She was led into a courtyard where no formal charges were read. There was no judge, no lawyer, just a mob and a question. The revolutionaries did not ask her to plead. They asked her to curse the king and queen, to denounce the monarchy, to join them not in belief, but in theater. It was a test of allegiance staged in blood. Her answer was a soft refusal. No curses, no betrayal, just a calm defense of those she loved. In that moment, she signed her death sentence. The crowd, already trembling with anticipation, erupted. She was pulled back through the gates and thrown into the street. What followed was not punishment, it was desecration. They beat her first, breaking bone and silence. Her clothes were torn away not for robbery, but for humiliation. Her body was violated, her dignity pulverized by men whose names history will never remember. Still, she did not scream. Witnesses claimed her eyes stayed open even as her scalp was torn, even as her body was kicked and spat upon. It took time for her to die, and yet death did not end it. Her corpse was defiled beyond recognition. Her heart was torn from her chest, her limbs hacked apart. But it was her head they wanted most. Severed by hands that shook with fury and thrill, it was carried aloft like a war trophy. Yet even this wasn't enough. Someone cleaned it. Someone combed her hair. Rouge was applied to her lips. Her lifeless face was dressed like a doll and mounted on a pike. Through the cobbled streets of Paris, her remains were paraded past bakeries, taverns, and alleys still soaked from other slaughters. The mob roared as it passed. Children pointed. Dogs barked. Windows shut. The spectacle drew crowds as if it were theater. And maybe it was. A grotesque performance of power staged for those who needed to believe the old world had truly died. But it wasn't just a parade. It had a destination. The temple prison loomed in the distance, a stone fortress now serving as the royal family's cage. Inside, Marie Antoinette sat in silence, already aged by grief, already hollowed by loss. When the crowd reached her tower, they called her name. They jeered. They lifted the pike. They held the head of her best friend to the sky, like an offering or a curse. Whether the queen saw it is still debated. Some say she fainted. Some say she collapsed to her knees and wept. Some say she refused to look. But the truth lives in what came after. From that moment on, she changed. Her letters turned grim. Her voice, once tinged with pride, became soft, resigned. Something had broken. The revolution had not just taken her throne. It had sent her a message, one written not in ink, but in blood. The days that followed her execution passed in a haze of silence and smoke. The body of Marie-Thérèse Louise de Lamballe, or what remained of it, was eventually recovered by sympathetic citizens who braved the anger of the mob. Her remains were hastily buried, without ceremony, in a common grave outside the city. No marble, no inscription, no prayer. For a woman born into grandeur and grace, whose life had once been measured by the rhythms of royal protocol, her end was reduced to a stain on the dirt and a whisper in the streets. And yet that whisper would not die. In Versailles, no portraits of her were ordered to be destroyed. No letters were burned. In fact, her name became a quiet hymn among those who still clung to the belief that monarchy had not only been divine, it had been human. Across the English Channel in London, salons lit by candlelight, and fear her death was passed from ear to ear like a secret. The nobility spoke of her not just with sorrow, but with a kind of reverence reserved for martyrs. They spoke of her eyes said to have never closed, of her calm, of her refusal to curse the Queen even when death bared its teeth. But in revolutionary France, there was no room for reverence. Her name was buried alongside her body, scrubbed from records, omitted from speeches. To speak of her too softly was to invite suspicion. To remember her at all was to commit an act of defiance. And still behind closed doors, people remembered. Quietly, painfully. In the months that followed, the violence did not slow. The heads continued to fall, clergy nobles, even moderate revolutionaries, who dared to suggest that the blood had run long enough. The guillotine became the new symbol of order. What Lamballe had endured without a blade was now being meted out with mechanical efficiency across Paris. What once shocked became routine. The line between justice and terror dissolved completely, yet something about her death lingered like smoke clinging to velvet. Perhaps it was the brutality. Perhaps it was the symbolism. A woman so gentle, so apolitical, so painfully private, turned into a grotesque public monument by the very people who claimed to be fighting for the dignity of man. Her loyalty had not been to politics, nor ideology, but to a person. And for that, she had been destroyed in a manner more theatrical than any verdict read aloud in court. The French monarchy would not last much longer. Within a year, Louis XVII was dead. Guillotined in the Place de la Révolution, his blood soaked into the same earth that had been walked by the mob who murdered Lamballe. Marie Antoinette followed soon after her trial, a mere formality, her sentence already decided, before her final bow. The monarchy that had stood for centuries collapsed, not in a battle, but in a series of executions and street parades, masked as justice and lit by torches. But long after the Republic was declared, long after the guillotine stopped its rhythm, her story refused to vanish. In émigré communities across Europe, her name was spoken with the hush of mourning. In Vienna, pamphlets printed her face beside angels and saints. In Rome, masses were said for her soul. In London, paintings emerged, showing her not in suffering, but in peace, her head gently resting against her shoulder, her gaze soft, untouched by horror. Back in Paris, artists and playwrights quietly returned to her image, not always faithfully, not always kindly, but always with fascination. Some depicted her as a tragic symbol of loyalty. Others cast her as a foolish noblewoman blinded by affection. And still others painted her as a victim of madness, the revolution's own reflection staring back at it. But what the revolution could never quite destroy was the unsettling contrast she embodied. She had no soldiers. She wrote no manifestos. She passed no laws. She was not a queen. She was not a spy. She had no property to confiscate, no power to wield. What she had, what had damned her, was something far more subversive than politics, human devotion. In a time when friends turned against friends, when silence was safer than speech, she remained constant. In a season of betrayal, she stayed. That decision, so quiet, so unfashionable, so personal, was interpreted as treason. And for that, she was not merely killed. She was performed, dismembered in public, paraded like a message, because it wasn't enough to remove her from the world. The world had to see what happened to a woman who chose loyalty over life. That was the terror of it. Not the blood, not the pikes, but the silence afterward. The silence that fell over the people who had cheered. The silence of a crowd that had gone too far and didn't know how to turn back. The silence of history pausing for breath. And in that silence, her name remained. Not in marble, not in textbooks, but in something harder to erase in memory, in conscience, in the soft, uneasy place where admiration meets guilt, where justice blurs into vengeance, where the revolution triumphant could not quite escape its own reflection. Years passed. Regimes rose and crumbled. New flags were hoisted over Paris. New anthems, written new slogans, etched into the marble of public buildings. The monarchy had fallen. The republic that replaced it gave way to an empire, then another monarchy, then yet another republic. France reinvented itself over and over, but something beneath the soil remained unchanged, the memory of what had been done in the name of progress. By the time the 19th century reached its midpoint, the story of Marie-Thérèse Louise de Lamballe had begun to resurface not in government speeches or official histories, but in whispers, memoirs and sketches tucked between pages of fading books. Artists painted her with a tenderness that bordered on reverence. Writers described her not as a noblewoman, but as a spirit of loyalty lost to time. Her life, once erased with such violence, returned in fragments, scattered across Europe, pieced together, like relics recovered from a ruined cathedral. The violence of her end had once served as a warning, but now it cast a different light. What was once seen as justice began to look more like a fever dream, a collective madness. Her death stood out not because it was bloodier than others, but because it was so personal, so deliberately cruel, so theatrically staged. It was no longer just history. It was conscience. In aristocratic circles across Europe, her name became shorthand for fidelity under fire. Among royalists in exile, she was quietly honored. Her portrait hung beside saints in private chapels. Women who had never met her named their daughters after her. Letters from survivors of the revolution referenced her like scripture, not to recall the monarchy's splendor, but to remind themselves that even in ruin, grace could endure. Yet not all who remembered her did so with sympathy. Among certain revolutionaries, she remained a symbol of a decayed world that had deserved to fall. Her elegance, her piety, her silence, all were seen not as virtues, but as masks for indifference. To them, her loyalty was not noble, it was dangerous. It was the kind of devotion that kept queens above justice and turned the suffering of the people into a footnote. And then there were those caught in between, historians, philosophers, and thinkers who could not look away from the dissonance her story created. They saw in her death a mirror held up to the revolution itself, an experiment born in ideals but twisted by bloodlust, a movement meant to free the people but too often powered by rage. In Lamballe's story they found no comfort, only questions. Why did a revolution that spoke of liberty need to desecrate a corpse? Why did men who claimed to fight for justice paint lipstick on a severed head? Why did silence and compassion in one woman provoke more hatred than swords or speeches? The answers were not easy, and that was the point. She became not just a character from a violent chapter in history, but a contradiction that refused to be solved. A woman who belonged to the ancien regime, yet inspired reverence, even among those who rejected the world she came from. Her story was not a cautionary tale. It was a wound. There was no monument raised in her name, no national day of remembrance. Her grave, if it can be called that, lies unmarked. Yet she is remembered, not officially, not publicly, but viscerally. In the silence that follows, stories too brutal to recount in full. In the discomfort that settles when revolution is celebrated, without acknowledging what was sacrificed in its wake. As time pushed forward, fiction began to reach for her. Novels borrowed her outline. Plays reimagined her final hours. Filmmakers cast actresses to play her, giving her the voice that history tried to strangle. Each version changed something, her motives, her demeanor, her fate. But what remained constant was the pull, the magnetism of her tragedy, the weight of what she suffered without ever striking back. In every retelling, her death loomed. But so did her defiance, not the kind shouted from podiums or scribbled in manifestos, but the quiet kind, the kind that refuses to lie, the kind that doesn't curse even when surrounded by hate, the kind that stands still when the world demands collapse. And in that stillness, in that unwavering refusal to become what the mob needed her to be, she found something beyond nobility, beyond status, beyond even sacrifice. She became a challenge to every regime that followed, to every generation that looked back, to every historian who tried to define her with a single sentence. She remains a question unanswered, a presence that lingers at the edges of the French Revolution like a shadow cast by the flame. And whether remembered as a saint, a fool, or a casualty of misplaced loyalty, one truth remains: she did not run. She did not yield. She did not curse the friend who had brought her to the edge. And in doing so, she outlived the world that killed her. Not in years, but in memory. The memory of Marie-Thérèse Louise de Lamballe drifts through history like a specter, neither entirely mourned nor completely condemned, suspended in the uneasy space between admiration and discomfort. Her death did not inspire a movement, nor did it galvanize armies. There were no revolts sparked by her blood, no manifestos written in her name. And yet, she lingers, not because of what she did, but because of what was done to her. Her legacy, carved not in marble, but in silence, became a haunting measure of how far a society can stray from its ideals in pursuit of vengeance disguised as justice. For generations, the French Revolution has been examined, celebrated, critiqued, and reshaped to suit the needs of the moment. It has been framed as the birth of modern liberty, the end of aristocratic tyranny, the awakening of the people. Its slogans, liberté, égalité, fraternité, still echo through the rhetoric of protest and progress. But buried beneath the triumphs are moments like hers, moments too brutal to fit the narrative, too raw to be polished by patriotic memory. And it is in these forgotten corners that the true weight of revolution resides. No law passed in the National Convention could explain what happened to her. No philosophical tract justified the parading of her mutilated corpse through the streets. Her story does not sit neatly within the revolutionary arc. She wasn't an oppressor. She levied no taxes. She imprisoned no enemies. She simply stood beside a queen. And for that, she was destroyed with a level of cruelty that unsettles even those who revere the revolution's ideals. This discomfort, the inability to reduce her to a villain or martyr, has kept her memory alive in a way official histories often fail to achieve. She doesn't speak in the voices of the Enlightenment thinkers. She does not argue her case in court. Her silence remains her signature, but silence in times of madness becomes its own form of defiance. And that defiance quiet, though it was exposed to truth that neither guillotine nor ideology could extinguish, that some acts of loyalty, however small, become unbearable for a world demanding absolute allegiance. The men who killed her would not outlast the era they helped create. Many of them met the same fate, consumed by the very violence they unleashed. Their names faded from memory, buried under the shifting allegiances of post-revolutionary politics. But her name persisted, not because she fought back, but because she didn't. Not because she triumphed, but because she refused to bend. In this way, she became something more than a victim. She became a warning, not just about the excesses of revolution, but about the fragility of virtue in a world ruled by extremes. She stood still in the center of the storm, untouched by hatred, unarmed against brutality, and in that stillness revealed the cost of unyielding grace. Her murder, so grotesque, so public, cast a shadow over every noble ambition that followed. Even as France marched towards secularism, democracy, and reform, her absence remained a silent question. What kind of freedom requires this? Outside of France, her story took on different meanings. In Britain, it was used to demonize the revolution. In Austria, it fed royalist grief. In America, where revolution had taken a different form, her fate served as a chilling counterpoint, a reminder that the pursuit of liberty, if unmoored from justice, could become indistinguishable from tyranny. She became a cautionary tale not just about monarchy or rebellion, but about how easily morality can be swallowed by mobs convinced they act in righteousness. And yet she was never made into a saint. No church canonized her. No republic offered her rehabilitation. Perhaps because her death is not easily sanctified. It is not clean. It does not teach a neat lesson. It disturbs. It lingers. It accuses. Her loyalty to Marie Antoinette was not political, but personal. And in that, she defied the revolution's logic, which demanded all loyalties be to the collective, to the cause, to the abstraction of the people. She remained human in a world that no longer had room for humans. She left behind no memoirs. Her letters, when found, were brief, delicate, and devoid of self-pity. Her final moments were not captured in declarations, but in the memories of those who watched, some in horror, some in thrill, all of them changed. What she witnessed in her last hours is beyond imagination. What she endured cannot be romanticized, and what she represents cannot be buried. The years moved on. The revolution became empire. The empire became restoration. Restoration turned again to revolution. And yet, through every upheaval, the image of a soft-spoken woman refusing to betray her friend has continued to surface in the margins of history like a watermark, only visible when held to the light. There is no statue of her in Paris, no plaque at the place of her execution, but there is a weight where her story should be, a gap in the triumph, a pause in the anthem, a silence that cannot be filled. And that silence, more than any scream, is what remains. Long after the guillotine fell silent, and the revolutionaries who once ruled with fire and fear had been buried by time, her story endured, not as a tale of power, but as a testament to quiet defiance. Marie-Thérèse Louise de Lamballe did not lead armies or craft manifestos. She stood beside a woman who would fall, and when the tide turned, she did not run. That choice, so simple on its surface, rippled far beyond the bloody streets of Paris. Her death was not a symbol of collapse. It became something else entirely, a mirror. Not to reflect her virtue alone, but to expose the violence hidden beneath ideals. Her silence told a deeper story than any speech. It left behind no slogans, only questions. What remains of loyalty when the world demands surrender? What does dignity look like when the crowd forgets what it means to be human? No monument was needed to preserve her memory. Her presence survives not in stone, but in the weight of remembrance. A woman torn apart, became impossible to forget. Her name, once whispered in terror, now rests in the uneasy place where history can't look away. Was she a martyr? A casualty of friendship? A necessary sacrifice in the march toward liberty? Or something else entirely, an echo of grace that refused to break even when the world around her did? Some names fade. Hers lingers. Not because she fought, because she didn't. Because she chose to stand when it would have been so easy to kneel. And maybe in the end, that is the legacy that endures longest. Not power, not vengeance, but the stillness of a single woman in a world that had lost its soul.